Okay, let's do part B, the second part of the digestive system. And so we're going to talk about the pharynx and the esophagus. So food goes from the mouth to the oropharynx. You remember that's the middle part of the pharynx. The pharynx is the chamber that connects the nose, the mouth, the larynx. And the part in back of the nose is called the nasopharynx. The part in back of the mouth is the oropharynx. And the part in back of the larynx is the laryngopharynx. Anyway, this is an area that allows foods, fluids, and air to it routes them where they should go. Just like in the mouth, we're going to line it in stratified squamous epithelium and produce mucus. The reason why mucus produces, stratified squamous is resistant to abrasion and all the food rubbing on it. And mucus producing glands allow us to lubricate and reduce the amount of friction we're having, amount of abrasion. The muscularis externa has two layers. The inner one is longitudinal, and the outer one is going to be circular. Pay attention to that. That's special and weird. The two layers is something you see in most of the GI tract, but not in, say, the stomach or the large intestine. This is, notice, two skeletal muscle layers. This is under voluntary control. This is where we start swallowing. Once we get down to the smooth muscle, that's no longer voluntary control. All right, so what is the esophagus? It's a muscular tube, flattened, that runs from the laryngopharynx to the stomach. You might remember when we talked about the respiratory system, we talked about C-shaped cartilages. The part right here that is not cartilage, that is smooth muscle. That is muscle, that is soft tissue, that is part of the esophagus right there. So my wrist, right wrist right here, would be where the brain would be, where it would be the anterior, the front of the body, front of the neck. And so the back of the trachea would be here, where we don't have a complete closure of the rings. That's a human thing, by the way. We've already said some other animals have complete rings, but humans have C-shaped rings. And then we have the flattened muscular tube of esophagus right there. All right. When it's not moving food along, it's flattened. So I should make it more like that. It goes through the the diaphragm at the esophageal hiatus. Because the stomach is located below the diaphragm. It joins the stomach at the cardial orifice. The gastroesophageal sphincter or cardiac sphincter surrounds the cardiac orifice. I'm probably going to use cardiac sphincter because most people are familiar with the term heartburn. And what heartburn is the pain you feel when you reflux past the cardiac sphincter and burn the bottom of your esophagus with stomach acid. Because that's real close to where the heart is located, a lot of people mistake it for a heart attack. That's what we call it, heartburn. Anyway, when you're not swallowing food, that should be closed. Mucus cells on both sides are supposed to help protect the esophagus from acid reflux. I just got done telling you they don't do a great job. They try. All right, so the esophagus has all four layers of the alimentary canal. What we're talking about is the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the adventitia. Why does the esophagus have an adventitia instead of a serosa? Remember, the serosa was a serous membrane. It's all slippery and they can move around easily. That's the last thing we want to do in the throat. We want the esophagus to stay in place behind the trachea. So we coat it with adventitia, lots of connective tissue, anchoring it to the surrounding parts of the neck. All right. So the mucosa, stratified squamous epithelium, abrasion resistant, changes to simple columnar at the stomach. That simple columnar is important. It's one of the reasons the stomach is hardened against the acid of the stomach. So the lining of the stomach, that acid is so strong that if we didn't do special things to it, it would eat the stomach. Okay. So we do 3 things to defend that stomach, the lining. One is we switch the cells all to columnar, tall, thin. So say the lumen is up here, this is where the stomach acid is. Only a very small part of the cell is exposed to the acid. And we have tight junctions that hold the cells together so you don't have acid getting down between them. So tall columnar cells with tight junctions, that's one way that we defend the stomach from the acid. Another way is that the top, the space that faces the lumen, we line that with a basic bicarbonate-filled mucus. So as the acid tries to get down to the cells, it gets neutralized. So that's another one. And the third one is that we reproduce those cells really fast. In other words, we have those 2 defenses, and they still don't work that well. That's really strong acid. You replace the entire lining of your stomach very often, about once a week, if I remember correctly. We'll find the date as we go along, but I think it's about every 7 days you replace the lining of your stomach because you digest it. It's bad. All right, so when we get to the stomach, we switch to simple columnar. That's one of the ways to protect the stomach. Now, the esophageal glands in the esophagus, in the submucosa, they make mucus. And that helps us move the food down the esophagus. Down the esophagus from top to bottom through a peristalsis. You need to know that's peristalsis when you move things like that. You also need to know that we call that mixture of food and saliva that's coming down the esophagus a bolus. We call the mixture of food and stomach acid that comes out of the stomach chyme. We still would probably call a piece of it a bolus, but anyway, the mixture will be called chyme at that point. The muscularis externa of the esophagus is unique because it's only smooth muscle at the inferior end near the stomach. Sorry, it's only entirely smooth muscle at the end. It starts out as skeletal muscle, and then partway down it goes to mixed, some skeletal, some smooth, and then at the bottom it's all smooth. What this means is that when you start swallowing, you start under voluntary control. But once that bolus gets about halfway down, you can't stop it. It's smooth muscle then. It's not voluntary. Okay. We already talked about the adventitia. So here we got the layers. We have our 4 layers. The mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, the adventitia. You still, let's just move on. You got the layers. All right. So you can see the change from stratified squamous right here. And in junction of the stomach, we switch to simple columnar. So, all right. Here we go. Heartburn and GERD. Stomach acid regurgitating into the esophagus. You can call it heartburn because you're burning the esophagus close to the heart, and some people, if they're not familiar with it, they mistake the pain for heart pain. That's the first symptoms you get of gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. If you eat or drink too much, if you are too obese, if you have pregnancy, or if you're running real hard, you can cause food mixed with stomach acid to squirt past that esophagus, that sphincter, that cardiac sphincter on the esophagus. It could also be caused by having a hernia there, where part of the stomach sticks up higher above the diaphragm than it should. I mean, it should be below the diaphragm. This can cause inflammation in the esophagus, ulcers in the esophagus, even cancer in the esophagus. So bad. Let's talk about digestive processes in the mouth, and then in the stomach, and then the intestine. So in the mouth, the pharynx and the esophagus are tubes to pass food to the stomach. The major function of both organs is propulsion, and that starts with swallowing. The fancy Latin-y, science-y way of saying swallowing is deglutition. Deglutition involves 22 different muscle groups and 2 phases. In the buccal phase, there is voluntary use of the tongue. When we get to the pharyngeo-esophageal phase, it's involuntary. It's mostly the vagus nerve that's controlling this. Swallowing is controlled by the medulla and the lower pons. Those are brain stem functions, if you remember AP1. All right. So here we have a 5-step process. And once you get to the pharyngeo-esophageal, this is involuntary. And you can see here their picture for stage 4. You have muscles contracting, forcing the bolus of food down. All right. So let's talk about the stomach. There are parts of the stomach I want you to know. Obviously, the area right around the cardiac sphincter would be the cardiac region. The big bulgy part that's off to the left side, that's going to be the fundus. If it helps you remember the shape, think of fundus as being written in lowercase. So you see the curve of the lowercase f. Well, the big bulge is the fundus. The main part in the middle is the body. And then the narrow little part by the pyloric sphincter is the pylorus. The larger of the 2 curves, the one that's further away from the diaphragm, we would call the greater curve, and the smaller one that's closer to the diaphragm, closer to the liver, closer to the heart, what I'm trying to say is superior. That is called the lesser curvature because it's smaller. Anyway, so the stomach is a temporary storage tank. You got that? Not the main organ in digestion. Main organ in digestion is your small intestine. So stomach's a temporary storage tank. It starts the breakdown of protein. Remember, we started starches in the mouth with salivary amylase. We start the breakdown of protein in the stomach. And the bolus of food is mixed with stomach acid, and we then call it chyme. An empty stomach has about 50 milliliters, tiny amount, but it can expand to 4 liters. Oh my word, it can hold a lot of stuff. By the way, the bigger you fill the stomach, backing up here, the more risk you have of heartburn. Don't overeat. If you're eating up until food coma all the time, you are overstretching the stomach, and you are risking having GERD, having it flow backwards and burn your esophagus. When empty, the stomach has many folds called rugae. Hold on, I'm gonna show you what we're talking about here. Okay. Okay, so look at this cactus. See these grooves, these wrinkles in it? That's what it's like when it's not full of water. Cactus live in places a lot of times where there's not much water. And then when there is water, there's all this water at once. Well, they will suck up as much of it as they can. Those wrinkles are it's gonna expand until you don't see the wrinkles anymore. So they're holding all this water inside. Your stomach is the same way. When we talk about the rugae, the folds in the stomach, what we are talking about are folds that you won't even see when you expand the stomach and fill it with all the fluid. So understand what those are folds or grooves that allow expansion. All right, so parts of the stomach, the cardiac part, the fundus, the body, the pylorus. I already said you needed to know them. And we're going to call this not pyloric valve. We're going to say pyloric sphincter the whole time. Now, the pyloric part of the stomach, that's the narrow part on the right side. The opening is called the antrum. That's like an architecture term. We use that all the time in buildings and stuff. We use that in biology a lot. Antrum is the opening. It narrows in the pyloric canal and then ends in the pylorus. And that's where we have the pyloric sphincter. Let's do a pretty picture. All right, so here we have esophagus coming in, the cardia, and the bulgy part that sticks up by the diaphragm, it's on the left side of the body, that's the fundus. And then we, at the other extreme, the other end, we have the pylorus. So this part is the pylorus from here to here. This is the antrum of the pylorus. This is the pyloric canal, but all of the tail end, if you think of this as looking like a tadpole, all of the tail end is the pylorus. The part between the fundus and the pylorus is the body. Okay. The rugae are these wrinkles you see everywhere on the inside. Those are the ones we talked about that allow expansion. Everything above the body in this big curve, this is fundus. The other curves, you have the lesser curvature here that's on the esophagus side, and the greater curvature that is inferior side. So, yay, we've got the stomach. Also notice we have the outer longitudinal layer. This should sound like the esophagus. We have the inner circular layer. This should sound like the esophagus. And here's the special part. Inside of that, we have an oblique layer, a diagonal layer. That's because the stomach doesn't just do peristalsis and segmentation, where it separates and then brings food back there, smashes it together to mix it. It's still doing mixing, but this third layer allows you to knead it, to really bend it around. Better mixing. Why? Because we want to mix the food with the enzymes that have to break down the food. All right, moving on. So there we have a stomach, esophagus, fundus, body, greater curvature, pylorus over here. All right, moving on. So the greater curvature is the convex lateral surface of the stomach. I guess you could say lateral. That is better because it's more oriented, but it's also inferior, down a little. The lesser curvature is the concave medial and superior. The mesenteries extend from curvatures and anchor the stomach to other digestive organs. You also have the lesser omentum running from the lesser curvature to the stomach. Let me tell you about the omentum. Remember we talked about mesenteries, anchoring the organs in place, serous membranes, they're stuck together, and then you have vessels running between them. Yeah, got that. The omentum, imagine a curtain of membrane hanging down with lots of fat in it, so much fat that they thought it looked like a lace, where in some parts it's barely there, and in other parts they're like huge globs of fat, so you can't see through it. That is the omentum, and you have a greater omentum and a lesser omentum. We'll go through that. All right. Oh, I'm not going far. It's right there. So the greater omentum hangs from the greater curvature and hangs down over the intestines, the spleen, the transverse colon. It blends with the mesocolon, which is a mesentery that anchors the large intestine to the body wall. Remember, I said in humans, our intestines tend to be anchored pretty well to the body wall. In some other animals, like horses, it's just not so. And that's why it's harder to have volvulus, torsion of the bowel, in a human than it is in a horse. Horses are real prone to that. Anyway, which is bad since it can kill your intestines. A lot of fat deposits, a lot of lymph nodes in the omentum, both the lesser and the greater. All right, so the autonomic nervous system, again, we're talking sympathetic, parasympathetic, supply the stomach. The parasympathetic are from the vagus nerve, and the sympathetic are splanchnic through the celiac plexus. So what are we talking about here? The sympathetic ones are the stop digesting, we have to run away. The parasympathetic are, this would be a lovely time to digest. Just chill, calm down, increase the flow of blood there so we can absorb the nutrients. It'll be good. Although, in reality, we don't do that much digestion. We don't do that much absorption in the stomach. We absorb water, alcohol, not much else across the wall of the stomach. The major organ of absorption is the small intestine. I can't tell you that enough times. All right, so blood supply to the stomach comes from the gastric and splenic branches of the celiac trunk and the veins of the hepatic portal system. What? Well, don't you remember I told you when we draw blood off of the GI tract, we're going to send it to the hepatic portal system. We're going to send it to the liver so the liver can examine it and make sure we didn't absorb anything bad to help protect us. All right. So the stomach wall has 4 tunics, but we've modified the muscularis externa. We've modified the mucosa. The muscularis externa, you've already seen the pretty picture. It's got an extra layer right here, an oblique layer that's on the inside. All right. Together, the smooth muscles allow the stomach not only churn, mix, and move chyme, but also pummel it, which increases the physical breakdown and let you ram it into the small intestine. Okay, so you break that food down good. Not as good as the teeth. The teeth is a more violent action, breaks them apart, obviously, but you have to go further. You want to, earlier they made the comparison to paste. That kind, when it comes out, you want it thin like paste, think toothpaste. You want it broken down that much. Okay. The mucosa is also modified. You have a simple columnar epithelium lined in mucus cells. It says entirely composed of mucus cells. They're secreting a 2-layer coat of alkaline mucus. Already told you that. The alkaline mucus is using bicarbonate that you get from the blood, the circulatory and the respiratory system. The blood buffering system that we talked about. Carbon dioxide that you normally would say, oh, we're breathing out. A lot of times, as that blood is going by, say, the pancreas, by the stomach, it'll be like, no, don't breathe out that bicarbonate. We need that. And they will pull the bicarbonate out of the blood and use it for, in the pancreas, making pancreatic fluid, and in the stomach, making alkaline mucus. So we have this super acid lumen, but we line it with an alkaline mucus to protect the cells underneath. We also have these gastric pits, which that's what they call it at the lumen end. They get down into gastric glands. Gastric glands produce gastric juice, stomach acid mixed with enzymes that work in there. All right, so here we have the pretty picture, and you can see the mucosa. You got these deep pits, these gastric pits, and we'll talk more about the different types of cells in there. You're going to learn about chief cells and that kind of nonsense. Anyway, so mucosa, below that submucosa. The mucosa still is mucosa cells, lamina propria, muscularis mucosa, thin, tiny layer, compared to the muscularis externa, which now is so thick we got 3 layers going on. And then we have serosa on the outside. If you remember, we had adventitia on the esophagus because we were anchored in place. We've got serosa now, so the stomach can expand, move around, and rub against other organs as it fills. All right, so 2 types of glands in the those gastric pits. So glands in the fundus and the body make most of the gastric juice. Okay, we have here glands include secretory cells, the things that secrete, things that give stuff off. The ones in the neck are mucus, make mucus, that bicarbonate-filled, lovely protect you mucus. But then we have parietal cells and chief cells and enteroendocrine cells, ones that make hormones. Again, we've mentioned it before. The stomach has hormone functions. It's not going to show up in your average textbook on, oh, these organs are endocrine organs. But by Skippy, the stomach certainly is, just like the atria on the heart are. They can make hormones and tell other parts of the body to do things. All right, so these pink mucus neck cells, the dark pink, the light ones are the surface epithelia, the mucus cells. But then we have the mucus neck cells. We have parietal cells here, scattered, so else. And then the bottom of each pit, these are our chief cells. And we're about to go over what each one does. So the mucus neck cells make a thin acid mucus that we don't know what it's for. We got no idea. The parietal cells, those scattered ones that were in blue in that diagram, they make hydrochloric acid, which could have a pH as low as 1.5. Oh my God. But 1.5 to 3.5. This will denature proteins, like modify them from their natural shape. It'll activate pepsin. Pepsin is a enzyme for digesting protein, and it's released as pepsinogen. And then when it touches acid, it turns into pepsin. When it touches that strong acid, and it can break down plant cell walls, like break down cellulose. Most bacteria get killed there, not Helicobacter pylori, which we'll talk about later. But most bacteria get killed by that acid. That's why, if you remember when we talked about the respiratory system, we had all those cilia passing mucus up from the trachea to the back of the throat to swallow it down to the stomach. Is because anything that you caught in that mucus, you can kill. Anyway, and they also release intrinsic factor. This is important stuff. This is a glycoprotein that you need to have to absorb B12. If you ever hear about someone who gets their stomach stapled or banded or a gastric bypass surgery or all that, they're going to have to artificially take extrinsic factor the rest of their lives, or they're not going to be able to absorb B12. So in their intestines anyway. Moving on. So we talked about the mucous neck cells, which are the ones right here. We talked about the parietal cells, which are right here. Parietal cells making the acid, making the intrinsic factor. Now we're talking about the chief cells, the ones at the bottom of those pits. Those make pepsinogen, which is turned by the acid into pepsin. Remember, activates the pepsin. Okay. Those are, and pepsin itself can turn pepsinogen into pepsin. That's a positive feedback mechanism. We also make lipases. Those are enzymes that break down fats, digest fats. Not the majority of fats, but some of that's happening in the stomach. Most of that's going to happen in the intestines. But moving on. The enteroendocrine cells. Remember I said hormones from the stomach. They're going to secrete chemical messengers into the lamina propria. You might say, why? What's this? What's happening there? Well, if you remember the lamina propria, where's my, okay, that may be the best picture we got. It's not a great picture. All right. Look at right here, the lamina propria. We're going to pass vessels and lymph and nerves through there. So if you dump chemicals in there, they can be carried off to the rest of the body. And these hormones, where we don't call them endocrine, we call them paracrine, because very short distance. Okay. I'm talking about serotonin. I'm talking about histamine. These are neurotransmitters. We also have somatostatin, acts as a pancrein, and gastrin. What we're saying here with somatostatin, it's telling the pancreas, hey, I've got food in me, I'm starting the digestion. Please crank up the production of pancreatic fluid, because we're going to need it. The reason you're going to need it is when you pass the chyme from the stomach into the small intestine. Remember, the stomach has the columnar cells with the very little surface area exposed to the acid. The stomach has the mucus cells with the bicarbonate mucus. The stomach has the highly fast reproduction rate to make new stomach lining cells. Small intestine's got none of that. So when you pass highly acidic chyme into the small intestine, it is going to fry and kill the small intestine cells unless you can stop it. And the way we normally stop it is having the pancreas dump pancreatic fluid full of bicarbonate in to neutralize that acid. Great. So somatostatin is the signal from the stomach telling the pancreas, I'm about to dump some really acidy stuff into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. Get ready to dump base in there to neutralize it. Let me back up. And gastrin. Okay, yeah, we're fine. All right, so here we have the parietal cells making the hydrochloric acid and the intrinsic factor. We have the chief cells making pepsinogen, which will become pepsin when it hits that acid, and the enteroendocrine cells, which make hormones and paracrines. That's a lot of stuff going on in a really small layer. We're just talking one single pit. Okay, so the mucosal barrier. the stomach conditions are harsh, and we need to protect the stomach. So the mucosal barrier protects the stomach, created by three factors. You got a thick layer of mucus full of bicarbonate. You've got tight junctions between the epithelial cells, and you have rapid cell division to replace the damaged cells. I said replace once a week, every 7 days. It's every 3 to 6 days. Oh my God, that stomach acid is powerful. Okay, moving on. So gastritis is inflammation of the stomach. Remember, gastric means stomach. So gastritis is inflammation of anything that breaches the stomach's barrier. Peptic or gastric ulcers can cause erosion of the stomach wall. If the erosions perforate, then you can get peritonitis and hemorrhage. You're spilling stuff out of the stomach into the peritoneum. Oh crap, that's major infection, bad. Most ulcers caused by Helicobacter pylori. Totally true. Can also be caused by non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs, like aspirin. Yeah, I know somebody who had that happen. They didn't follow the instructions that said, "Oh, don't take this medicine that's for pain and anti-inflammatory. Don't take this unless you're doing it on a full stomach." And they took it regardless of whether they had a full stomach or not, and it ended up well, they got a bleeding ulcer. Anyway, that's enough detail. Anyway, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about this Helicobacter pylori thing. The dude, Barry Marshall, who discovered this, he got the Nobel Prize. And he also is probably the most completely insane scientist in history, because he was like, I think I know what's causing ulcers. I was like, yeah, shut up. Stress is causing ulcers. It's stress. And he's like, no, no, no. I know what's causing ulcers. and I can prove it if you just give me a bunch of money. And he's like, the other people like, no. And he kept begging, and finally somebody in his lab was like, oh, here's a very small amount of money. Okay. And go experiment on some guinea pigs or rats or something, do whatever. And he couldn't get this bacteria to grow. Yeah, the goal was like, infect the rodent, it grows and they get sick, and then, oh, look at the ulcers. He couldn't get it to work. And he got really desperate. And I'm not making this up. Look up in Wiki. He drank a bacterial culture, and then within a couple days, he had pre-ulcer, like it didn't get to a full-blown ulcer, but he had symptoms of it. So he drank a bacterial culture and had them endoscope him and look. The people in his lab looked like, oh my God, look what you did to yourself. He's like, well, you see, I did the thing. I proved it. Like, okay, shut up. Just take your antibiotics, man. And that's how they killed the Helicobacter pylori in his body. But then they're like, okay, first of all, he's crazy, and we got to give him money to stop him from doing things like that again. And second, well, that is a pretty intriguing result. So they then funded the research again, and he ended up getting the Nobel Prize and finding out that most ulcers are not stress. Most ulcers are Helicobacter pylori. It's a spirochete, a little corkscrew-shaped bacteria, and the reason it causes ulcers, it's one of the bacteria that is hardened against acid. It can survive under those conditions that they're so acidic they kill most bacteria. And what it does is we have these columnar cells all tight and tight junctions holding together. It burrows its way, spinning around like a drill bit, cuts apart those tight junctions and goes down. But what it does is it leaves behind it a path that stomach acid can go down. And on the sides here, you've got no nice basic mucus doing protection. And so you start digesting the simple columnar cells laterally until you now have a hole in the lining, and yeah, it's bad. Bleeding ulcer on the way. All right, so moving on. Oh, and there's a picture of one. Doesn't it look painful? It should. It's disgusting. All right, and there we have the Helicobacter pylori screwing things up. Bad. Okay, so digestive processes of the stomach. What does the stomach do? It is where we do breakdown of food. It's a holding area of food. It delivers chyme to the intestine, small intestine, the duodenum, the first part of the intestine. You're gonna have to memorize all the parts of the intestines. We call the small intestine the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. Anyway, it delivers chyme into the duodenum. It denatures proteins. Hydrochloric acid denatures them. If you're into ceviche, where they cut the raw fish real thin and then they squeeze lemon or lime over it, yeah, you're trying to do the same thing. You're cooking, you're denaturing with acid. Pepsin carries out the enzymatic digestion of proteins. The milk protein casein is broken down by renin in infants. And that results in a curdy substance. Yeah, renin is harvested. We actually make it synthetically now too. That's used by cheesemakers. Anyway, moving on. Liquid soluble alcohol. Sorry, lipid soluble. Duh. Okay, so lipid soluble alcohol and aspirin are absorbed into blood across the stomach lining. So is water. The only stomach function essential to life is the making of intrinsic factor to absorb B12 later on. B12 is something we need to make red blood cells. And if you get a stomach bypass and don't take your intrinsic factor, or don't take your B12, you are not going to be able to make red blood cells and you'll be really sick. So they give B12 injections to people if they bypass their stomach. Prepare for often shots in the butt. Okay, moving on. I don't honestly know if they put it in the butt. But yeah, wherever they give shots. So your gastric mucosa makes 3 liters of gastric juice every day, more than 3. And we regulate it with the vagus nerve saying to make more secretion, the sympathetic saying to make less. That makes sense. Let's back up. Vagus is parasympathetic. Anyway, so hormonal mechanisms. Gastrin, remember, made at the bottom of the pit, bottom of the gastric pit. Gastrin stimulates hydrochloric secretion by the stomach, and gastrin antagonistic hormones from the small intestine. All right, so the gastrin secretions we break down into the cephalic phase or reflex phase, the gastric phase, and the intestinal phase. In the cephalic phase, cephalic, of course, think head, conditioned by what we're seeing, what we're thinking, what we're smelling. This is the whole Pavlov's dog thing. The gastric phase, which lasts 3-4 hours, is when 2/3 of the gastric juice is released. What stimulates that? Actually, stretch receptors in the stomach because it's filling with food. That gives both long and short reflexes. You might remember short reflexes travel a short distance. Those are internal. The long reflexes are coming from outside, things like what the vagus nerve is telling you. Let's see, chemical stimuli, partially digested proteins, caffeines, drop in the amount of acidity. It starts to get real basic or move towards neutral. It's time to release the stomach chemicals. So That'll cause the G cells in the enteroendocrine system to release gastrin. All right, so stimulation of the gastric phase. When the release of gastrin will cause hydrochloric acid to be released from the parietal cells and activate enzyme secretion. That'll cause the parietal cells to make hydrochloric acid, we said, bind to receptors on the parietal cells. The enteroendocrine cells will release histamine. I don't know for sure, but my guess is that the target cells will respond like we talked about before, an inflammation response. I'm guessing the histamine will cause the blood vessels to dilate, vasodilate, and get permeable, so it's easy to absorb things. That would be logical, but I'm not certain it's correct. Anyway, the buffering action of the ingested proteins will cause the pH to rise, and that will activate more gastrin secretion. All right. How do you inhibit the gastric phase? Low pH. Once you've made more acid, you stop the making of acid. This occurs during digestion as a negative feedback mechanism. The more protein, the more hydrochloric acid you make, causing a decline in pH, which then inhibits the gastrin secretion. Great. They repeated themselves there. It was probably good enough to tell you it was a negative feedback. Anyway, the intestinal phase begins with a brief amount of time where you're stimulating and then you inhibit. So you're going to stimulate as partially digested food, let's use the right word, chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. Chyme enters the small intestine, and that will cause the release of intestinal gastrin. That will make gastric glands in the stomach continue to do their thing. And this period of stimulating that happens, we just talked about, is brief, and it's overridden by inhibitory stimuli really fast. In other words, the intestines, remember I said they can't handle the acidity very well. You can't dump all that stuff at once into the small intestine. So as it starts to fill up, it'll be like, okay, stop, that's enough, don't send anymore. So the inhibition of the intestinal phase, the intestine saying to stop, there are four main factors. Hold on a moment. And pause record. Okay, sorry about that, folks. The duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, is going to fill up with chyme coming from the stomach, mixture of food and stomach acid. And that acidic chyme, that fat-filled chyme, it is hypertonic, meaning it's real concentrated. So, and this will vary with the meal. Some meals are more fatty than others. Some are more acidic than others. But if anything is true there, if the duodenum expands a lot because you have a lot coming in, if the chyme in the duodenum is real acidic, if it's real fatty, if it's real concentrated, hypertonic, this will inhibitory effect to protect the intestine from being overwhelmed. It's basically going to tell the stomach to knock it off for a little while. And there are two ways that we do this: enterogastric reflex and enterogastrones. So let's go through the two. The enterogastric, the duodenum will inhibit secretions by nervous system reflexes. Send nerve signals to the stomach saying stop. This is sympathetic nerve. This is vagus nerve, long reflexes. The gastrones these are hormones, secretin and cholecystokinin. Remember I said that we had the exchange of short-range paracrines, hormones that work over very tiny distances. That's what cholecystokinin is doing. It is the duodenum telling the stomach to knock it off for a little while. Like, we'll take your food, but slowly. So just chill for a little while. All right, moving on. So here we have events regulating gastric juice. This is figure 2319. I'm not going to expect you to reproduce this chart or anything like that. I do want you to understand the things that we said in the previous PowerPoints. What I would recommend is that you use this chart as a study guide. So if you're able to fill out, hey, what happens whenever the stomach is filling? What occurs? What does that stimulate? That type of thing could be useful. Now, table 23.1. This is more like what I'm interested in. And I will tell you right now, yeah, okay, looking at this, cholecystokinin, the first row, I'm interested in you knowing that. Histamine, intestinal gastrin, interested in you knowing that. The glucose inhibitory peptide, we didn't talk about that too much, so I'm thinking we're not going to focus on that very much. But those are the hormones in the where we talked about the stomach and the intestine being hormone based, even though you don't hear people talk about, that's examples thereof. Let's see, on the next page of it, 2 of 2, not interested in motilin, but secretin and serotonin. The 3 in the middle, secretin, serotonin, somatostatin. Those are the 3 on this page that I'm interested in you knowing. So I'm not saying I'll ask every one of those. Let's see, there were 3 here. There were 1, 2, 3. Yeah, if we did both gastrins, that'd be 4. There were 4 on the first page, 3 on the second page. Those are the ones I'm most interested in. I'll probably ask about 1 or 2 of those total. I'm not going to ask everyone. There's too much material on this test. But that's where we'll pull from if we ask about which of the hormones. So, all right, let's talk about how you make hydrochloric acid in the stomach. The parietal cells are, remember, those were the ones that in the diagram, they were in blue, but they were scattered. They were below the mucous neck cells. They pump hydrochloric acid from the breakdown of carbonic acid. They pump hydrogen from the breakdown of carbonic acid into the lumen. And they do this because we have hydrogen potassium pumps, ATPase pumps. So as we pump hydrogen into the lumen, bicarbonate is exported back into the blood. And that's because we have an antiporter that exchanges chlorine ions and bicarbonate ions. This is useful. The resulting bicarbonate, increase in bicarbonate that's leaving the stomach, call this the alkaline tide. Well, guess what? If we're making the blood alkaline in the abdomen there, we need to harvest some of that with the pancreas to make the pancreatic fluid. Pretty smooth. All right. So here we have how it works. And the alkaline tide, I really want to make a roll tide joke, but I don't think anyone would laugh except me. Anyway, yeah, so that's what's going on. Come on. All right. So what do we do in response to the stomach filling? The stomach stretches, all those rugae flatten out as we get bigger. 2 factors cause the pressure to remain the same until about 1.5 liters of food is taken in. One is reflex-mediated relaxation of smooth muscle, coordinated by the brain. In the brain stem, we have the swallowing, like pons medulla area. Gastric accommodation. The smooth muscles have stress relaxation response. The organs can stretch because muscle is pretty stretchy. So the muscle relaxes enough to let them get bigger without having too much pressure build up. All right, so that's great. It stretches, then we're going to fire stretch receptors. The gastric contractility activity, what they're talking about there, peristaltic waves move food towards the pylorus at a rate of about 3 waves every minute. So about every 20 seconds, you go moving things towards the pylorus, the tail end of the stomach, right by the intestine. And the basic electrical rhythm is set by pacemaker cells. You used to call them a special name, the pacemaker cells of Kajal. Well, that sounds like a really bad video game. Anyway, the pacemaker cells are hooked together by gap junctions, so the entire muscularis contracts. This probably sounds really familiar. If it doesn't, you don't remember the stuff from the heart pacemaker cells. Anyway, distension and gastrin increase the force of the contraction. So the more we fill the stomach with food, the harder the contractions are. The more gastrin we have, the harder the contractions are. The contractions are strongest at the pylorus end, right by the pyloric sphincter. 30 milliliters of chyme is produced. You deliver it in really small amounts. Like every time you squirt chyme into the duodenum, it's going to be about 3 milliliters. And the remaining 27 go back into the stomach. Only liquids or very small particles are allowed through the pyloric sphincter. What that means is you got to break that food down really, really good. You got to have it tiny, tiny. Oh, great. And here we get to ugly stuff. Mechanism of acute allergenic immediate hypersensitivity response. Where did that even come from? This is bronchial stuff. This should not even be in this chapter. I have no idea why that's there. We're skipping it. Okay. So the pyloric valve at the end here, the fundus at the top, the body in between. We are squeezing food, moving it down towards the pylorus. And as we do, every time the food slaps against the pylorus, we can squirt a tiny bit, about 3 milliliters, through the valve. And because we got our 3 layers, we can do grinding of the food, mix it up real good. We close the pyloric valve, and most of the food is bouncing back up into the fundus. Now, the duodenum can stop the overfilling of itself. It can control how much chyme gets in. It has stretch receptors, chemical signals. The enterogastric reflex, I already said you're sending gastrin. You're sending hormones to tell the stomach what to do. Enterogastrones. Those will tell the stomach to knock it off and prevent the overfilling. The stomach will empty in 4 hours after a meal, but if you have a lot of fat in the meal, that might take more than 6 hours. Why? Because the fat, you're not going to be able to break it down fully until it's in the small intestine and mixed with bile from the liver to increase the surface area. That just breaks it into small drops. And then you're going to have pancreatic lipase and brush border enzymes working on it. It's going to take some time. So a lot of fat, you slow everything down. If your meal is full of carbs and not so much fat, that's going to move through the duodenum pretty fast. All right. So homeostatic imbalance. Why can you have some vomiting? Well, extreme stretching. If you fill the stomach too much, you might have the stomach want to get back to normal size and cause you to puke it out, vomit. You could also have intestinal irritants, bacterial toxins, too much alcohol, too much spice in your food. Like, oh, I must have the ghost pepper chili. Yeah, that's going to make a lot of people vomit. Certain types of drugs, chemicals, or sensory impulses. Like if you put me on one of those roller coasters where you go backwards through the loop, I promise you I will throw up. I've done it before under those exact conditions. A lot of lesser roller coasters are going to make me nauseous. Anyway, moving on. So that would be sensory impulses. Excess vomiting could cause dehydration, electrolyte and acid base imbalances, alkalosis. Yeah, if you're vomiting too much, you're gonna make yourself sick. Liver, gallbladder, and pancreas are accessory organs. Good, we're going to talk about these associated with the small intestine. The liver, its digestive function is the production of bile. It actually has a whole bunch of functions after we do absorption, when we pass the nutrients to it through the hepatic portal system, and then we analyze to see if there's anything bad we took in. Like your body right away is going to start trying to break down toxic things like alcohol. And yes, alcohol is a poison. It is a toxin. It's just that the ethyl alcohol that people like in their liquor and their beer is less toxic than other alcohols like methanol. Bad stuff. Anyway, the liver makes bile. Bile is an emulsifier of fat. That's a fancy way of saying it's a substance that breaks the big droplets of fat into smaller droplets. If you take one big droplet of fat and break it into a bunch of little droplets, you got more surface area. And that's more area for the enzymes to work on it, and more area for the molecules to get broken down. If you have more surface area, then you can have more enzymes on there. More enzymes means more activity. So the gallbladder's chief function is to store the bile. Like the liver makes the bile, the gallbladder stores the bile, and the pancreas makes most of the enzymes that are used for chyme. I know the pancreas is famous for its job with insulin and blood sugar, but it makes the enzymes that are used in the small intestine. It mixes them in with a bunch of bicarbonate that will neutralize the stomach acid. The pancreas makes the fluid that stops the chyme from burning the duodenum. So, all right, gross anatomy of the liver. It's the biggest gland in the body. It's like 3 pounds. You have a right lobe, a left lobe, a caudate lobe, and a quadrate lobe. Caudate like caudal, like towards the tail. You'll see it on the picture coming up. There is a falciform ligament that separates the larger right lobe and the smaller left lobes. It also suspends the liver from the diaphragm and the abdominal wall. Then you also have what they call the round ligament, ligamentum teres. That used to be the fetal umbilical vein, and it's shriveled up now because it's not used, until you have just the connective tissue left. All right, so here we're looking at the liver from above, okay? And the right lobe is huge, and the left lobe is a hell of a lot smaller. You can see the gallbladder back here underneath. If you flip it over, that's when we're going to see the caudate. Anyway, but you see the two ligaments, the ligamentum teres or round ligament, and the falciform ligament. All right, here we have it from underneath. You've got your gallbladder and the bile duct that carries bile from the liver into the gallbladder. The hepatic vein has been cut, but that's where blood from the digestive system goes to the liver. But we have our caudate lobe, that little tiny one hanging down underneath, and the quadrate lobe, that little tiny one right next to the gallbladder hanging down. The hepatic artery and hepatic portal vein are right here. So I was wrong to say hepatic vein. Everything I was describing on bringing in the blood for the nutrient-rich blood from the GI tract, that's hepatic portal vein. All right, so moving on. So the lesser omentum anchors the liver to the stomach. Remember, that's coming from the lesser curvature of the stomach. The hepatic artery and vein enter the liver at the porta hepatis. The bile ducts, we have bile ducts there. The common hepatic duct leaves the liver. The cystic duct connects it to the gallbladder. And the bile duct is what we call it when the two come together. So common hepatic duct coming out of the liver, cystic duct going to the gallbladder. Those two things come together, and you have the bile duct. There's a pretty picture. It actually looks a lot better than that drawing, just because of the color contrast, easier to see. But remember, the quadrate is the little tiny lobe hanging down next to the gallbladder, and the caudate lobe is the one up by the hepatic vein. The falciform ligament separates the lobes, the round ligaments right next to it. All right. Microscopic anatomy of the liver. The liver lobes are divided into lobules, which are shaped like a honeycomb. They're little hexagons and composed of plates of hepatocytes. What that means is sheets almost of liver cells, hepatocytes, and they filter and process the blood. Each one of these lobules has a little central vein in the middle. In fact, at the corners of the lobules where they come together, you have what they call the portal triad. Triad has three. You've got a hepatic artery, you've got a hepatic portal vein, and you have a bile duct with little bile canaliculi feeding it.